With so many border options out there, it's so tough to settle on the one that's perfect for the blanket that you just spent hours and hours and hours and weeks and days and months and maybe even years crocheting. I've been there. So while I can't make that difficult decision for you, what I can do is share 5 of my favorite borders that I think are worth considering. You don't have to have a specific number of stitches within your blanket to make any of these borders work. That's part of the reason why choosing borders is so difficult. You have to make sure your border that you really, really like works with the number of stitches in your blanket. And that's not impossible, but it's certainly not easy. The first step to creating any good border to make your blanket look the best that it possibly can is to put a single crochet border around the entire blanket first before you add your border. The difference is kind of subtle and it'll vary from blanket to blanket and project to project and person to person, but ultimately, when you have a foundation of single crochet stitches to crochet your border in, you have a much neater line. So with that out of the way, let's look at the first border. And this one is really unique. It's probably the most unique on the list, and it's really grown in popularity over the years for good reason. This is such an interesting, unique, clever way of bordering your projects, and I absolutely love it. So I typically like to start off this border somewhere near the corner, kind of next to it, and you'll start with any number of chains that you want for the width that you want your edging to be. You'll add 1 chain after that, and then you can single crochet in every chain. So I really do like to use single crochets for this ribbing because it makes a slightly wider rib. It works up a teeny bit faster than if you used a slip stitch, for example. So once you've single crocheted into all of your chains, you'll slip stitch to your blanket, you'll chain 1 and turn, and then make a single crochet through the back loop only of your stitches. And that's basically the repeat. You're just working back and forth. You do have a chain on each side just to help you with the turn. It doesn't count as a stitch or anything. And you're working specifically in the back loops only of your stitches, no matter which stitch you're using, because that'll give you the ribbing kind of look to it. Now I actually went 1 step further with this one, and I made a single crochet border with my taupe yarn, my edging color yarn as well, because for me, I think it looks a little bit neater when you do it that way, because you have just a nice even jump from one color to the next, if that makes any sense at all. You definitely don't have to go this extra step if you don't want to, but I think it's worth the extra time. You can definitely substitute with other stitches. I personally like the look of the single crochet here because I think it's a nice balance between not taking forever to crochet but still kind of looking like a ribbing pattern. But you can definitely get away with using a slip stitch if you like the way maybe like a ribbing, a knit ribbing looks. Or you can even try a half double crochet if you want something that takes a little bit less time, still looks like ribbing, but maybe is a little bit more loose. I used this border on my corner to corner baby blanket pattern, which by the way, if you haven't tried corner to corner crochet, you're seriously missing out. It's one of the most fun techniques and just interesting ways to crochet a square that, yeah, you just have to give it a try if you haven't. So I'll have that pattern linked in the description below if you want to give it a try. But yeah, I love the way this border looks with this stitch pattern, but you can pair it with anything that you want because the border is pretty textured. You can easily get away with a stitch pattern that's maybe not quite so textured, but it also pairs really well with a stitch pattern that is textured. So you can play around with it and see if this is the right border for your blanket. So the next border on our list is a modern braided border, and this one is one of my newfound favorites. So here it is worked on a swatch with Tunisian simple stitches, just another way that you can see how you can pair any of these borders with pretty much any stitch pattern. I've got a variety of stitches here so you can see what they look like. So again, I started this swatch with a single crochet border, and then I also created a single crochet border around in my border color, just because there's such a contrast between this yarn and this yarn. I think it just looks a little bit cleaner. So another thing to point out here is how I worked the corners. For this pattern, and actually all of the patterns, the borders here, I make 3 single crochets in those corner stitches, and then you can really just work around them. You don't have any like intricate corner patterns or anything like that. They all just kind of flow around the corners, and it's just super simple. So for this border, I like to just start off where I left off on my single crochet round. You'll insert your hook in the next stitch and then yarn over and pull up a loop, just like you're doing a normal single crochet, but you'll pull that new loop through the loop that was already on your hook, and then chain one. Now you can also get really clever with this one too. I really like to play with my single crochet rounds on this one so that the border really stands out. Here I have just, the most simple version. We have our must-have single crochet border in our blanket color, and then we have our border color with just one single crochet. But if you've seen my latest granny square blanket pattern, I actually use this border for that. And I made a couple of extra rounds of single crochet just so you can see the border a little bit more. It kind of stands out a little bit more. Really great. One of the best borders to try, and just really interesting. You don't see something like this a lot, and that's what I really love about it. So when you get to your corners here, you don't have to worry about anything fancy. You'll just continue with your braided single crochet stitch pattern all the way around your blanket, and that's all there is to it. I mean, this one couldn't get any simpler. So what kind of border list would this be if I didn't include a traditional, a classic, a beautiful granny square border, granny stitch border rather? You can use it with squares or with no squares at all. You can add a granny stitch border to a project that doesn't already have granny squares in it. It's just one of those borders that's a classic, and it's beautiful, and it's really easy to crochet. Not to mention you're working with double crochet stitches, so if you're really on a time crunch, this is one of the borders that will work up the quickest for you. So I like to start these off in the corner. I'll make half of this corner first, so 3 double crochets here. And then I'll just, continue with my 3 double crochets between my double crochet clusters of the previous round. And it's just as simple as that. Now, if you're not using this border with a granny stitch or a granny square project, you can still use this border. You'll just need to skip a few stitches in between your clusters of 3. So your first round will be kind of like your setup round, where you'll make 3 double crochets, you'll skip 2 or 3 stitches, you'll make 3 double crochets in one, and you can play around with that technique. And then after you've made that setup round, you'll just crochet a normal granny square round from there. No matter which option you choose, when you get to the corners, you'll work the same corner pattern, 3 double crochets, chain 2, and 3 double crochets. This is the only border on the list that has a specific corner pattern, but it's nice and easy when you're working with familiar granny stitches. The other really great thing about this border is you can add as many rounds as you want, and it really grows very quickly. It's one of the quicker borders to crochet on this list. Here I have just 2 rounds of granny square stitches, granny stitches. I keep saying granny square. It's really just a granny stitch pattern. I like 2 rounds minimum. It's kind of like my favorite for this one, but you can add as many as you want, as many as you feel like you need for your blanket. It's a great way to add additional length and width to your project as well, if maybe your blanket turned out a little bit smaller than you wanted. If you don't have a granny square blanket that you're working on or that you're adding a border to, I do have a really great new pattern for just a classic granny square blanket. I'll have that linked in the description as well, so you can check that out. Okay, I've kind of saved the best 2 for last, and I'm really trying to figure out which one I want to show you first because I love them both equally. Let's go with the Pico Dot Border. I absolutely love this border. It's a really great way of adding a more intricate or fancy look to your blankets if you're into that sort of thing, but you can also really, really modernize it by just not having as many picos. There's also a lot of customization that you can do with this border in how big your Pico dots are and how far they're spaced apart. So in this swatch, I have a Pico dot every other stitch. And so it gives you like this nice frilly kind of lacy look to it. I've crocheted this one on a swatch with the alpine stitch because, this stitch pattern is just a really popular choice for blankets these days, but it's also really, really textured. I wanted you to see how that looks together, to see that you can really get away with having a border that has a lot of interest and pairing it with a stitch that also has a lot of visual interest. So the Alpine stitch is a great one for blankets. I'll have a tutorial and the written instructions linked below if you want to give this stitch pattern a try. Highly recommend it. And I also like to start this one off near the corner. So I'll fasten on, make a single crochet, and then you add your picots. So the picots that I want to try here are 3 chains high. So you'll make 3 chains and then slip stitch in the first chain that you made. And that's what creates your little Pico Dot bubble thing. And then I'll make another single crochet for my picot stitch. So this is where you can really customize and do whatever you want for this border. I'm just making a single crochet between my picot stitches for that more roughly kind of pretty look. But yeah, you can totally customize it and make it work for your blanket. If you know what number of stitches you have to work with in your width and the length of your blanket, you can factor that in. But with working the 3 single crochets around each corner, you can also just carry this around and you can really get away with a lot here. The other thing that you can do to customize this border would be to use 2 chains instead of 3 chains. You could also go as high as like 5 chains if you want more of a loop than like a Pico Dot. That's something you can play around with as well. But yeah, one of those borders that's really visually interesting, very pretty, and still extremely easy to crochet. So that's the Pico Dots border. Just absolutely love this one. But the next one, I think I could possibly love even more. This one is the Beaded Tassels border, and this is another one that has really, really grown in popularity over the last couple of years, and for obvious good reason. This is just a fun and interesting way to border your blanket, and you can add this border to any of the borders that you've already seen before. That's one of the cool things about it. But you can also use it with a variety of stitch patterns as well. So this swatch is a woven stitch swatch, another one of those stitches that I think is so highly underused. I think it's such an interesting stitch pattern, so beautiful, but it also looks really great with this border. This is more of a flat stitch pattern, although it is still very textured and there's a lot going on with it. But this border around the edge just really, really pops, and that's what this border brings to the table. If you need something super interesting to look at on the edge of your blanket, this is definitely the way to go. So you'll first start out with 2 chains, and then you'll add 3 more chains. Now these 3 chains will count as 1 double crochet in your popcorn stitch, which is what the little beads are. Make 4 double crochets in the chain that you're holding on to, so the second one that you made. And popcorn stitches are really cool. Once you have your sort of fan of stitches here, pull up on your working loop and just make sure you don't undo any stitches and remove your hook, stick it through the first double crochet, which remember is our chain 3, and then collect that working loop on your hook again, and then just simply pull it through that first double crochet, and it kind of bubbles it up and makes this really cool little bead for our border. So I'll keep going here in this way, but there's a lot of customization that you can do with this border. The first thing you can do, if you know you want your tassels to hang a little bit further from the blanket, then you can make more chains before you start. Just make sure you have 3 that you can, count as a double crochet for your popcorn stitch. And then however many chains you start with, you just need to match on the other side so it's even. The other thing you can do is change up the number of stitches that you're skipping in between. So when you get to the corners, I really just continue on with my normal stitch pattern. You can get really methodical, I guess, or really organized about this and start and finish in a particular place based on how many stitches you have in your blanket. That takes a level of planning that not everybody wants in their project. So you can plan, but you don't have to plan either. If you're okay with the beads kind of landing in more random places around your blanket. That's what I did here. I really just wanted to show you that although all of the corners don't look exactly the same, it still looks pretty good, and there was really no planning that went into this whatsoever. The only thing that you might consider is how many stitches you're skipping between and making sure that that works with the number of stitches that you have in your project. So let's have another look at all of these borders so you can see them side by side. And I know it's really tough to finally decide on which border is right for that blanket that you've spent so much time on. And I honestly think that any of these borders could absolutely be the right choice for you because I know they're easy. I know that they're easily adapted to fit any blanket that you need, but they're also really easy to crochet and they don't take a ton of time, with the exception of the ribbing one. That one definitely takes probably twice as long as any of the other borders, but I mean, look at it. It's totally worth the extra time for the right blanket, if this is the look that you're going for. So I know you had a chance to see me kind of crochet these borders on these swatches, but if you're really serious about trying any of these borders, I have the written instructions on how you can adapt them for your blanket, how you can make them, how you can make changes, and all of that stuff on my website. I'll have that post linked in the description below so you can check that out. But you know, if you're really struggling to come up with the right border still, there's a couple of things that I like to keep in mind. First, think about your blanket. Do you have a lot of really intricate stitches? Do you have a lot of really pretty colors, and you want your blanket to be the focus when somebody looks at it? Well, if that's the case, if you want your blanket to be the focus, then maybe go with one of the more simple borders. Something like the braided border is a great way to finish off the edging in kind of a subtle but really interesting way. Or do you have a blanket that's a little bit more plain? Maybe you've got a single color. Maybe you have a pretty plain stitch pattern. You've just got something that doesn't have a lot of visual interest in the blanket, and so you want to bring a lot more interest to the border. Well, in that case, I would definitely go with something like the ribbing border here, or the beaded tassels border, or the Pico Dots border. Like, I would say these three definitely bring a lot of visual interest to the edging of your blanket. Whereas these two are a little bit more subtle and unassuming, but still very pretty and a great way to finish off the edge of your blanket. And you know what? The bottom line is choosing a border for your blanket is really nothing to stress over. Yes, it feels like a very difficult decision. I am the queen of indecisiveness, and so I do struggle quite a bit to find the right border for my blanket. But I do typically find myself coming to one of these 5, and that's why I wanted to share them with you today. They're really easy, very approachable, very adaptable, and I think that one of these could absolutely be the way to go for your blanket. So the maroon yarn here is Manos del Uruguay Maxima yarn, I believe, and the color is called Oxblood. This is a beautiful yarn. It has a nice semi-solid kind of tonal look to it. I just absolutely love this yarn. I think it's gorgeous. And the border yarn is another favorite of mine, Malabrigo Rios. So this is the worsted weight version, and the color is called Whole Grain. So I'll have both of these yarns linked in the description as well. You can usually pick these up at a local yarn shop. You can sometimes find them on Amazon if you like to do your shopping there. And you can definitely pick them up on other online shops as well. And if any of the blankets caught your eye in this video, I also have free patterns for these on my website, so I'll have them linked in the description below. Or if you want to support the channel, or you like to have your patterns printed or saved to your device, I have that option for you in my shop as well. B.Hooked.com is our shop for all of our PDF patterns. We have some digital pattern bundles that I've curated, some fun projects I think that you'll like to work on, but you can also make your own bundles with some pattern discounts for buying multiples. We have some t-shirts if you're into that sort of thing, and we also have some printable cards, bands, and tags that you can add to your gifts. You can provide the care instructions, personalized notes with the cards, and that sort of thing. Thank you so much for the support there. Thank you so much for watching. Happy hooking, and I'll see you in the next one. And don't stress, seriously, about the blanket border. Go with your gut. It's usually not wrong.